Hello everybody, welcome to Nottingham Contemporary. My name's Emma Moore, I'm the Assistant Curator for the public programme here, and a very warm welcome to you all. Thank you for joining us this evening. The installation for Bizmuth and Spiny Oyster, in which we're currently sitting, was prompted by the film I Am the Mouth by Agnieszka Polska upstairs. I'm sure some of you have already had a chance to have a look at the film. But that film was actually my first introduction to ASMR, or Autonomous Sensory Meridian Response, if I got that right or the wrong way around. And having seen the film and then doing a quick sort of Google search on ASMR, which yielded these like endless videos of seemingly really mundane scenarios, which were accumulating hundreds of thousands of views online, it seemed like a very almost like stumbling on a very strange, unknown online community, but totally engrossing. And looking into it a little bit more, you kind of felt I'd revealed a bit more about the sort of contested area that ASMR is. You know, its legitimacy then is debated in Zoe Fothergill's work, the one behind us here, Keep Delete, in these very hushed, whispered tones. We hear the argument for its legitimacy as a field of research or inquiry. And when I was looking back through, I can't remember what magazine it was, but it was something from earlier this year. There was a 2-page article on, I forget what the title of it was, but it was this new form of relaxation for our very stress-laden lives. And then getting into it, it was all about ASMR and how this has become a very calming and very relaxing mode for people. So it seemed like maybe this kind of unknown online community was slowly coming to the fore. So it seemed quite timely then to have this conversation, and I'm very happy to welcome and introduce our two speakers this evening. To my left, Zoe Fothergill, who's the artist in whose installation we are sitting, and Michael Banissy, who has very generously offered some science, as I keep saying, on the subject. So just to give a very brief introduction to our two speakers. Zoe Fothergill graduated from Edinburgh College of Art with an MFA in Contemporary Art Practice in 2012. She was awarded the John Watson Prize, which culminated in an exhibition at the Scottish National Gallery of Modern Art in March 2014. Michael Banissy is Senior Lecturer in Psychology at Goldsmiths in London. He's Director of the Non-Invasive Brain Stimulation Lab at the Department of Psychology in Goldsmiths, and his research interests include emotion recognition, synaesthesia, and empathy. And these fields, I think, are what Zoe and Michael will discuss in relation to the installation here. So a very quick run through this evening's proceedings. Zoe will give a sort of 10-minute introduction to her work and her interests and how you came to be involved in ASMR, and then Michael will give a sort of 10-minute intro as well on some of his research and the work that you're doing, which is kind of leading into ASMR more so now. And following that, we'll sort of have a conversation between us, but we would very much like to include your views, and I hope that some of you have had a chance to look around the installation, and it will be really interesting to hear your responses. And we do have a roving mic, so if you do have questions, just stick your hand up, and Sam will get the roving mic to you, because we are recording this evening's event, and we're also live streaming it, so it's going out there into the internet as we speak. So do hold on for a mic. So I will hand over to Zoe.
Thank you very much, Emma. It's a real pleasure to be here tonight, and thank you for inviting me to speak, but also for the invitation to show work here in this fantastic space. I would also like to extend a welcome to you all, but also to our internet watchers, viewers, who I think it's particularly apt to have with us this evening, given the content of the exhibition. So welcome to you as well. So yeah, I thought I would start with a phrase that has become resonant for me. Can I see that? I don't know if you're familiar with that here, but people say that quite often to me. Can I see that? And what they actually mean when they say it is, can I touch it? Can I have it in my hand so I can understand it better? And it's in that intimacy between touch and vision that I choose to situate my work. And in the last few years, I have predominantly been working with film. So my research has progressed to be focused on the relationship between sensory perception and screen. I thought I would start my introduction this evening by showing you 3 short films that I've made. The first is just a minute long. It was originally shown in 3D through a viewing device that had a leather visor and a velvet button that needed to be pressed in order to view the film. And I'll just let you know that there's no audio on this film. Okay, Jim, do you want to play the film? Thank you. So the film's title is Fingersmith, and in it I set out to re-inhabit the peep show form for a female gaze. It was shown in 3D and it's been shot with the action being performed direct to camera, and I was really interested to explore whether it'd be possible to have a sort of intimate directness through that. And one viewer, I remember commenting that they felt as though the action was happening to their brain when they were viewing it. And with the button that needed to be pressed in order to view, I was interested in exploring whether the viewer could become aware of their complicity in deciding how much they would view to bring awareness to their own visual libido. And at the height of the button was at crotch height, so I was also interested to see if parallels could be drawn between the hand of the viewer and the hand that they were watching. And it was really interesting watching people's responses to the film. There were smiles and blushes, and I guess even though it's just a hand, it was really clear that attitudes to female sexual pleasure varied quite considerably, and I was intrigued to see how a film could elicit embodied responses. So then the second film I'm going to show you is just under 2 minutes, and this time it does have some audio. So Jim, if you could show it, please. Thank you. So that film's title was Flutter Crusher, and I thought I would share with you now a short excerpt from a text that I wrote to accompany the show when it was first shown, and this was in the publication. She says, eyes lustfully announce our incontinent visual greed for endlessly deferred pleasure. He says, let's deconstruct the new femininity of men who hug and women who leer. She says, embrace the thrill of the license to imagine herself gazing. So it's a combination of footage that I shot myself with found footage, and really is the beginning of my path into exploring user-generated content as a field site, I guess, for study, but also as a material source for filmmaking. So the third film I'm going to show you was a commission from Modern Edinburgh Film School and the Embassy Gallery for their collaborative project Green Screen. I found a clip of someone stroking a bee. It's a tiny, short, little 10-second wobble, I guess, but there was something really compelling about it for me. So I decided to remix that clip into 3 short, interconnected films of found footage. And the film as a whole explores tactile experience, how it's learned, taught, and shared. And there are 3 films. I'm just going to show you the middle film, and it's just over 2.5 minutes long. Okay, Jim.
Hi, everybody. It's me again, and I just wanted to say a quick thank you to all of those that have given suggestions and requests for songs. Also to Whispering Scott for the great shout out in her video. It made me smile pretty big, and I did a little goofy dance and everything. I thought maybe I would take a few minutes just to tell you a little bit about myself. Maybe you can relate to some issues I'm having, or give advice, or just be there to listen, or maybe it'll put you to sleep. And if that is what works, then that's good too. I am 30 years old, just recently turned 30, and I'm excited about being in my 30s. I was scared for a while, but I think that it should be a good year and then a good decade. I have recently started finding gray hairs at random. Can anybody relate? I do color my hair now to keep up with that. I feel like an old lady just saying that, but it's just the way life goes. I'm kind of proud of where I am in life as far as doing things that I've always wanted to do. I've been able to do a lot of things that I wanted to do as a child, and so I'm happy where I am. I think that's probably about it for now. I appreciate anybody who's still listening. Anybody who comments or has suggestions, I appreciate that. If there's something you want me to talk about, please feel free to send me a message or something. I'll be happy to do what I can. I've got several requests for songs right now, and I'm working on those. So I will probably put up one of those here in the next few minutes. Thanks again for watching, and I hope that this has relaxed you a little bit, these random ramblings of mine, and it's nice to meet you.
So for me, I find the whispering conspiratorial. It draws me in. It does something to shut down the remoteness that I often feel in relation to mediated technology and screen. And I guess it resonates also for me with some ideas about sensory theory by proponents such as Laura U. Marks, where they think about the physical qualities of light and projection having less a delineation of subject, object, and observer, but much more to do with the surface of things, the in-betweenness, the liminal, a sort of new skin and embodied spectatorship. The audio that you hear there is Snarky Whispers, and she was my introduction into ASMR. So when I was putting that film together, I was intending to arrive at a sort of synaesthetic experiment, I guess, of where I might try and manifest the touch, the experience of stroking a bee in sight and sound. And so I was Googling for whispering, and I stumbled upon the massive whispering community associated with ASMR. So yes, as Emma has already said, ASMR stands for Autonomous Sensory Meridian Response, and is a tingling sensation that people feel often in the back of their heads in response to particular triggers. And those triggers vary quite considerably, but whispering seems to be something that works for lots of people. So just to give you a bit more background then on ASMR, so as far as I understand it, it began forming in the 2000s and has grown exponentially since then. Predominantly on YouTube, a really large community there. So even within this year, so in March this year when I Googled ASMR, I got about 1 million hits. I did it this week and there were 6.5 million. So you can see by that how much this subculture is beginning to explode. It was first referred to in a thread titled "Weird Sensation Feels Good." Then went on to be referred to as attention-induced euphoria, also as head orgasm by some people, and briefly as the Society of the Sensationalists before there seemed to be a consensus of settling on ASMR, which is a term coined by Jennifer Allen in a Facebook group in 2010. Wikipedia defines it as a neologism for a perceptual phenomena characterized as a distinct, pleasurable, tingling sensation in the head, scalp, back, or peripheral regions of the body in response to visual, auditory, olfactory, and/or cognitive stimuli. And obviously, since I started making this work, I have been discussing ASMR with all sorts of friends and colleagues. And it turns out that 3 of my friends identify totally with the sensation. They've had it since they were children. They didn't realize there was a name for it, and they also didn't realize that other people experience it. So that gives you some introduction to my work and how I have come to be here with you today. I'm going to hand over now to Michael. So thank you.
Cool, thank you. Yeah, thanks for passing over, and thanks to everyone for coming along and listening to us talk about, obviously, Zoe's work. My name is Michael Banissy. I'm a cognitive neuroscientist based at Goldsmiths, as Emma said. And basically, this means that I play with brains for a living. I'm interested in studying how our brains contribute to our psychological experiences and our perception of the world. And I suppose why I'm here really is because of two lines of research which I work on, which in some ways certainly feed into ASMR. It's actually fed into us having an interest in this experience ourselves now in a research sense. One of those interests is in synaesthesia. So for those of you who don't know, synaesthesia basically refers to a merging of the senses that it's normally experienced separately. So a very common example is something like grapheme color synaesthesia, where people will hear or see letters, and this will evoke a secondary experience of colour. Other examples include things where people might hear words and they'll experience tastes. So these are percept-like sensations, they'll experience tastes on their tongue. And one type of synaesthesia that my lab's worked on quite closely is something called mirror touch synaesthesia. And this is where people experience tactile sensations on their own body. So this can be touch, it can be pain, it can also be tingling sensations. They experience this when they see touch being applied to other people's bodies. So for example, you might see touch to someone's face like this, and a mirror touch synesthete will experience a sensation on their own face. So in some respects, similar to ASMR insofar as you're getting induction of tactile experiences. dissimilar insofar as the experiences in mirror touch are typically mainly driven by the visual stimulus, so it's not so much auditory stimuli, it's just vision, and it's very specific. It's seeing somebody being touched and evoking touch, and also the fact that the sensations are mapped one-to-one. Yeah, so if a mirror touch synesthete sees somebody touched on the face, they experience it on their own face. It's not so much it's a general tingling sensation or a location at the back of the head. So that's one element really, I suppose, how I'm here to give sort of some input to discussions. And it's actually part of that which has led my own lab recently alongside Aga Yannick, who unfortunately can't be here tonight, but she works with me at Goldsmiths, to begin to try to be interested in trying to study ASMR ourselves, because we're very interested in this, you know, as a perceptual experience, and what types of stimuli can evoke these types of tactile and tingling sensations that are seen in the ASMR, and also what's happening in terms of neural differences. So can we identify differences in the brain between someone who has ASMR, has an ASMR experience, versus somebody who does not? And this is work which we're now starting and trying to move forward with. The other aspect of my work as well, which probably also brings me here, is more general. It's not just about synesthesia that we're interested in. We're also interested in all of us as a whole, and how we all represent the experiences of other people, and how we all have empathic responses to them, and how we interact with the environment around us. And obviously, ASMR is a very interesting concept in this sense, insofar as you've got a variety of different stimuli that can induce these experiences, and it's quite often kind of reciprocal relationship, and that relationship isn't just in relation to other people, but it can be in relation to objects and a variety of stimuli. So it's very interesting to think about how our interpersonal representations expand to not only include others, but how the concept of other can include other objects and so on and so forth. So really that's kind of my main background, really, quite a brief intro from me, I suppose, but I suppose that gives us time to go into various questions and talk about your work.
Okay,
in a lot of detail.
Thank you. So I guess we thought that this next section we would loosely associate to the 3 films in the exhibition, though it may go off-piste a little bit too, but that's the sort of general idea. So I thought I would just give a very brief summary, I guess, of the Keep Delete film that we're going to focus on to start with. So I don't know how many of you had a chance to look at it yet, but it focuses on the show and tell side of ASMR. So I've sort of identified ASMR as having 2 quite distinct categories. The show and tell, which is where people bring material and demonstrate it to camera, often with a sort of soft, soothing voice, but stroking and tapping, taking lots of time to describe that particular object. And so I've chosen a whole selection of those to put together. And while I was doing my research into ASMR, I discovered that the Wikipedia article about ASMR has actually been deleted on 3 occasions. So it's obviously an area of quite contested knowledge, and I guess I had understood, perhaps naively so, that Wikipedia had a sort of democratic kind of ethos about it, that you could put up anything you wanted really, and it just then got negotiated with the community. But actually they're really quite strong frameworks in which anything that's posted needs to sit. And it was really interesting. So there's a really lively talk section that's kind of behind the front page. I don't know how many of you have been there and looked at it, but for the ASMR page, it was really clear that people in the ASMR community who experience it were coming up against and failing to persuade people from the more scientific community who had a feeling as though anything that needed to be posted needed to have some sort of scientific research behind it in order for it to be validated in any way. So the film kind of combines those 2 things together by a whispered narration of the discussion preceding the deletion of the page. So that's been archived on Wikipedia, so with all of these different show and tell videos. And I guess I was interested to ask you in relation to that about was the same true for synesthesia, that once upon a time no one believed it and it was also very contested knowledge?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of interesting to draw parallels in a number of ways between ASMR currently and synesthesia and the history of it, because synaesthesia actually has a long history. You can trace back reports of it to the 1800s. But it wasn't really until the 1980s that people, in a way, started to take it seriously. So quite a drawn-out period. And part of the reason why people started to take it more seriously, it became more of a topic that people studied in detail, was because we were able to develop methods to verify people's experiences, and I think that really led to a real paradigm shift, and this was with the advent of new techniques in cognitive psychology and cognitive neuroscience, so things like brain imaging came along. We were able to try to verify the experiences that people had, but it's quite interesting to consider the idea that there was definitely a resistance to it. I mean, like I say, there were these first case reports, and there was some work to begin with, but the trouble with the very early reports was no one could really verify it, and that's why it then fell out of favour, and it really came back much later in the 1980s. But it's interesting when you look at synaesthesia as a condition and the way people kind of respond to it, and similarities in a way with ASMR in terms of defining criteria, and also the idea of how people necessarily with synaesthesia weren't aware of it for a long time as well. And I guess with ASMR, there's been a raise in awareness because people have realised, this experience, not everybody has that. And I guess that's something that's come through in many respects, and certainly I would imagine in terms of that's part of the Wikipedia page, what you've seen as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess it's fascinating too that people have found each other through the online world, and particularly when so much of this material is to do with sort of tactile experience or very visceral sorts of things. It seems perhaps contradictory in some ways that people have come together through that, but also I think there's a sense in which people who experience it have tended not to talk to each other about it or talk to other people about it. They've felt a slight shame perhaps in the experience, and there's something about, like, say if you were observing somebody doing something and that's the thing that's giving you this pleasurable tingle, I think people have been sort of conscious that maybe they're zoned out and looking a bit weird and they're watching somebody for too long, and so there's something a bit socially kind of unacceptable about the sensation itself, and so I think that's been maybe part of the reason why people haven't talked about it very much. Right. And there's something about, I think, the online community where there's a bit more of a freedom and people are sort of prepared to share more information than they might otherwise if they needed to do it face to face.
I suppose that also comes back a bit, maybe not in exactly the same manner, but if you look at synaesthetes as well, a lot of them have reported that they may have mentioned something. So synaesthesia is actually present throughout from childhood. It's developmental, and a lot of them might have said they raised something about saying, does anyone else have this experience when they were a child? And the reaction that they got to it was negative, so they kind of suppressed talking about it for a while. And I suppose in some respects you could almost imagine a similar thing happening in this context. And again, that's that kind of validity of seeing other people reporting and being more confident to come out and talk about their experiences, which I think can really have an influence.
Yeah. And so do you sort of conceive of yourself then, I mean, can you see that process of someone experiencing something and not feeling as though they're being believed or having that experience validated, that the scientific research that you do somehow, you become a gatekeeper for some communities in changing that position for them so that they can become accepted into the canon of neuroscience in a way, that mirror touch perhaps? Yeah,
I mean, it's something that you find a lot of time when we've had reports from people who have mirror touch synaesthesia saying, that's what that is now, and it does in some way give them a sense of kind of validity, and they can identify and name what that experience is, and they do certainly report positive benefits from that. I mean, I'm not sure if I can take credit for that one.
But you're part of that community, I guess.
But we are part of that community. And it is a case of, as I say, I mean, it's kind of amazing actually when we work with people with all types of synaesthesia is how surprised they are also sometimes to even realise that their experience is any different. To what, because to them also, because it's developmental, there's two sides to it. There's some people who may have mentioned it and had it kind of shut down, but there's another group who, this is what I've had all my life. This is no different. What's so strange about it? So it's almost like an awakening to them that I have this, and this is so. There's two ways to it, I suppose, in some respects, which I guess is perhaps quite similar with ASMR in many ways, because a lot of people are just like, this is what's so new here?
Yeah.
This is just my experience.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
But I mean, the interesting thing, just going back to the original questions about how you go about validating something and defining it, I mean, like I say, with synaesthesia, it took quite a while, and even once we started having methods that came through, as I say, in the kind of late 1980s, to try to verify certain types of experience of synaesthesia, it was still a contentious issue, and I would say now there's not really an argument about the authenticity of a synaesthetic experience, but you are talking about sort of 20 years of research that's got us to that point. Yeah. And so as much as there are maybe a handful of people that are perhaps starting to become interested in testing and validating ASMR, it's sad to say, but in a way it will be a long journey to get that kind of pure validation that maybe people are really looking for and wanting, because also ASMR's so complex in terms of the different levels of inducer that can induce experiences. I mean, we'll probably talk about that in relation to some of your next work. But because of all the different factors that feed in scientifically, you've almost got to strip some of those away and just focus on one at a time to try and get to any kind of level of being able to say, right, we can validate that bit, but now can we validate this bit? And it takes time to almost build it in as well.
Yeah, great. Yeah, no, I mean, I think that process by which you will select the material that you will use to induce and test, I think is really fascinating, and I'd love to be a fly on the wall to sort of see how that comes about. So maybe we should move on then to the next film, How Does That Feel? Which focuses instead on the role play aspect of ASMR. And they're really varied. One that's really popular is the cranial eye exam, and another is a visit to the hairdressers, makeup, those sorts of things. Some of them are really quite outlandish. So there's one that's a girl who sort of is an intergalactic travel agent, and she proposes that you are there as the client trying to decide on which planet you would like to go to and so forth. So, but what they have in common is this really direct to camera viewpoint, which is quite different actually to the sort of history of theatre and cinema where you're watching the action on stage rather than having the action come to you. And so it's absolutely throwing away that fourth wall, that's that sort of imagined barrier between audience and stage or performance, as it were. And I thought, just as introduction to this, I just read a couple of quotes from the Book of Touch, which has been edited by Constance Claassen. And in the introduction, she suggests that the attraction of advertising, television, or the internet are designed to be consumed by the eyes and the ears. The endless appeal to the sense of touch one finds in contemporary visual imagery, unaccompanied as it is by actual tactile gratification, may have helped make touch the hungriest sense of postmodernity. And then in the same book, David Howe, in his chapter Skinscapes, Embodiment, Culture and Environment, proposes, in the 21st century, it would seem that many people must make their way through several landscapes, electronic, urban, and the old earthy one that persistently breaks through the cracks in the pavement. It remains to be seen whether we will put together a wardrobe of matching skinscapes, a pastiche of tactilities, or whether certain environments will simply become alien to our touch, while another becomes a second skin. So yes, I thought they were both a good introduction to this idea about having that fourth wall disappear. And not only are some of them direct to camera, where they're responding to your imagined responses, and so it goes on like that. There are also some where they're using 3D binaural microphones. I'm not sure if anyone's familiar with that, but basically you have a microphone in each ear, and so when you play the sound back, the sound will move around as it would naturalistically, so you get a sense of that. And in order to do that, sometimes they use prosthetic dummy heads, because you need to actually have the matter in between the ears in order for the sound to be exactly as it would be naturalistically. So some of the film has those prosthetics in it, and some of it also has people doing it direct to microphone, so the microphone sort of becomes a prosthetic for your head. And I was kind of interested in that technophilia, I guess, that we have in that film. And so I guess I had questions coming out of that about whether ASMR sort of feeds into some of the traditions of therapeutic conditions where the person is being sort of held in unconditional positive regard, and whether it has potential, I guess, as a sort of therapeutic tool in any way from that point of view. I don't know if you had any thoughts about that, because it certainly is thought of as always a pleasurable experience, whereas I have the feeling that synaesthetes quite often say that actually it can be quite debilitating. So
yeah, I mean, it's interesting to look at it. I mean, I think certainly when you sort of contrast sort of how does it feel relative to your sort of keep delete video, it's actually interesting to look at the differences in the types of stimuli there and how that varies, because obviously in the role play stimuli it's a very different kind of mental process in a way that you go through. You haven't got just like passive induction from viewing viewing somebody sort of rolling up a towel or something like this, relative to actually someone physically telling you and giving you instructions, and you can almost have to mentally simulate what it's like to be in that situation. So from a kind of psychological and a sort of neuroscientific standpoint, it's always interesting to think about maybe there's different mechanisms contributing to the two of them. That's sort of one aspect, but I mean, in terms of your question about sort of therapeutically, yeah, I mean, I suppose that's it's a very hard one to answer because there's no data.
yeah.
And I suppose that's always a tough one. But I mean, the nature is there designed to try to relax people and put them in that relaxed state. And I suppose I mean, you could see means in which that might be beneficial for people. In relation to synaesthesia and synaesthesia sometimes being negative, that is true. So some people report that synesthetic experiences can be overwhelming and they can get a level of sensory overload. There's a lot of noise in the environment. And so in that sense, it can be a bit too much. In the context of something like mirror touch synesthesia or mirror pain synesthesia, I mean, these people can say it can be quite intrusive sometimes because they are literally experiencing the tactile sensation of people around them, even if they don't want to. Yeah, they just see someone over there, bump into somebody else, and they're getting a sensation from that. And so, in that regard, I suppose there is a difference, right? Because you almost are seeking these videos out, based on in terms of what you're saying, in terms of that kind of pleasurable aspect. Whereas in something like mirror touch, you will just in your environment see someone bump into somebody else, and that can evoke a sensation that you don't necessarily want. You can almost feel overly social, which in some ways could be a negative to it as well. But I would just turn that back slightly and say if you do talk to most people that have mirror touch or most people that have any type of synesthesia, they tend to report it's perfectly fine. Some say it's a positive experience, some say it's a neutral experience, but there are obviously some people for whom it's negative. I guess it just depends on the intensity and the extent to which you get it, how overwhelming the experience can be.
Okay. I mean, I really enjoyed watching your presentation that was online as part of a symposium that they had at the Tate that was organised by filmmaker Daria Martin, who made a film Sensorium Test that takes mirror touch as its sort of starting point. And in it you were talking about mirror neurons as being a kind of important aspect, and also talking about the sort of discrimination between self and other being important. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about those aspects.
Yeah, sure. So I mean, in terms of mirror touch and things like that, it's not, I mean, mirror neurons commonly gets brought in. It's not so much mirror neurons, it's mirror systems, which is, it's a subtle but an important difference. So mirror neurons are cells which have been found in primates, which have been shown to respond both when you perceive an action and also, in this case, when a monkey kind of executes an action. So it's when it perceives and executes, it's the same type of cell that will activate. In humans, we have evidence of things called mirror systems, and this is mainly because we haven't done sort of single cell recording. We've just recorded with brain imaging, which gives a global perspective on the brain. And you find that if we perceive actions, we activate similar areas of our brain as when we execute actions. But the interesting thing in humans is this has also been shown to extend to other domains, so things like touch. So if you see somebody being touched, we all activate similar areas of our brain as when we are touched ourselves. And so these mirror systems, certainly in the context of touch, appear to play a role in mirror touch synaesthesia. So the idea is what we see is if I show anybody in a brain scanner videos of somebody being touched, we'll all activate part of our somatosensory cortex, which is part of the brain that prominently responds when you're touched yourself. But in people who experience mirror touch synaesthesia, so people who have these tactile sensations, these systems are overactive to a point. And there's kind of been two theories put forward about why that happens. One is threshold theory, which is the idea that they go past, well, we all activate the system, but there's some level of conscious threshold where if we activate it to a point, we go past that point, we'll actually start to feel physical touch ourselves when we see it to somebody else. That's one theory behind it. An alternative theory, or a complementary one, is that it relates to our ability to distinguish others from ourselves. And the idea is that if we, the idea behind this is that the extent to which we all activate our mirror touch system, or our mirror systems, we activate it more based on people who are more similar to ourselves than different to ourselves. So self-similarity can drive the activation. And what we've been able to show in mirror touch synesthetes is that they have slightly unusual boundaries of self-representation, such that they're more likely to incorporate others into representations of their own body. And that might mean they get this overactivity within the mirror system. But to try and draw that all back to ASMR a little bit, in some ways you can see how some of these mechanisms might play a role in some of the experiences. So if you are seeing someone having a tactile experience to themselves, then the idea would be all of us, as I say, we mirror. Neurally we mirror these experiences. So something like a mirror touch system might contribute in that context. The only problem is that doesn't really account for all aspects of ASMR, because you can experience tingling sensations even without seeing somebody being touched. But it's important to flag there that there is evidence that even hearing sounds can also activate tactile regions of your brain and can have contributions. So there's a variety of different levels in which mechanisms could shift in, and that's again one thing we're interested in, certainly in terms of research, is actually looking at whether there's maybe, although we have this umbrella term ASMR, perhaps there's many subdivisions within that and distinctions, and that comes down to what induces the experience and what doesn't. And for some people, it may be driven more by things like simulating and mirror systems, possibly. But for others, those who experience things more with objects and so on and so forth, maybe there's a different element that feeds in. So I think there's a variety of mechanisms that could come into play. But it's all very speculative at this stage because we don't have any data. Just to add that in.
I can imagine we might be coming back to that. And I do think that's an interesting thing about, you being prepared, I guess, in some ways, to put your head above the parapet and be the scientist that is going to do the first paper on ASMR, because I think that's, it's important that people feel as though they can put themselves in that position, I think.
I mean, it's clearly an interesting experience. It's interesting to try to validate or establish whether we can validate it or not.
Absolutely. And one of the things I was interested in the research that you've been doing into mirror touch is that in the lab you use screened examples. So instead of having the person actually there with the touch happening to your face, you're using videos of the people. And also that for some people that touch on objects works, but for other people it doesn't. But that you found that in lots of cases on the dummy, it doesn't work at all on a dummy head. And I guess I was interested in how that then might relate to some of the prosthetics that we see in that How Does That Feel film, where I was conscious and a little bit concerned, I guess, when I was putting that film together. I really wanted to have that content there, actually seeing the microphones, the binaural mics and all of that kind of stuff, because I think it's fascinating visually how all that stuff looks and seeing behind the scenes. But I also was really aware of how it kind of pulls you out of the illusion of this role play scenario, and I had some of it really early on in the edit, and I felt as though I had to push it back and have it kind of later on. And I don't know, I was kind of interested.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's kind of interesting I suppose that kind of feeds into the question of how do we attribute animacy to things, you know, what is human and what isn't human. In terms of, maybe not so much in mirror touch, but just in all of us, in terms of our body representations, our body representations in our brain are very malleable. You know, there's a lot of plasticity there, such that if we, I mean, this has also been shown in sort of in monkeys, showing that if you, for example, train someone to start using a tool, let's say in our case, I mean, a TV remote or something like that, you see that your representation of the body, to begin with, it'll be around your hand, but then after you've been using the tool for a bit, it actually extends to incorporate that into your body representation. So your body representations can be really dynamic and change. I suppose that's interesting in the context of, you know, in terms of your videos, how you're kind of mapping in, intermixing the objects with the faces and how they might start to be mapped in some way onto our own body representations, and how that may, in some respects, sort of feed into it. So I think that's one element to it. I would certainly.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Thinking.
Okay. It's good. I don't know how we're doing for time. Is it about right to move on to the last?
Do you want to,
the
talk
last
about
of
the
the
last
films?
film,
Yeah.
and then maybe we can open
Okay.
up for some questions from the audience.
Yeah, great. So the last film was on the screen behind me here, and its title is For Bizmuth and Spiny Oyster. And when I was thinking about this film, I spent a lot of time trying to identify what the motivations might be for the people who are making the ASMR videos. They call themselves ASM artists. So I was trying to work out what their motivations might be, but also trying to think about the people watching too, and then also the role of the sort of technology and media in that mix. And I came to a branch of psychoanalysis called transactional analysis. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that particular branch, but it originated in the 1960s in California, and its originator is a man called Eric Byrne, and he wrote a book called Games People Play, which was really intended originally to be a sort of guide for his fellow practitioners, but actually became a bestseller in the 60s. I think it was 64 when it was released. And it catalogues the patterns, the sort of repeat patterns of behavior that he saw in his clients. And some of them are really very familiar, that sort of what if, yes, but sort of scenario that can kind of go on and on and on. And but basically, transactional analysis is a study of our need for recognition, and he gives a unit of recognition, the term stroke. And so then he starts discussing all of that in a stroke economy, where we sort of negotiate our need for recognition with other people, and whether that's physical or emotional or both. And so at that time, another practitioner, Claude Steiner, started a group called Stroke City, in which he tried to initiate in the group a way of giving each other positive strokes without any kind of underlying other agendas. And actually they found after a period of time it was quite difficult to arrive at that, but when they did, they ended up experiencing a sort of remarkable euphoric sensation in response to it. And he went on to write this folk tale in sort of true 60s fashion that became quite popular. And in it, we are all born with this bag of warm fuzzies that we can dip into at will, and there's an endless supply, and we can keep giving them to people as we go through our lives. But then at one stage, another character is introduced who suggests that actually there might be a limited supply of these warm fuzzies, and instead introduces cold pricklies as an alternative to that, or sort of negative emotions and negative recognition, which is preferable to no recognition at all. And so it then, the whole story, I guess, is about this sort of battle between these two, and whether there is a potential that we could have a sort of endless supply of warm fuzzies. And so I guess in some senses this film is a loose interpretation of that, in addition to my kind of transactional analysis of the motivations of the players in ASMR. So the fur that you see in the film plays the character of the ASM artist, sort of warm and inviting and comforting. And the cold pricklies is the viewer protected in their bedroom or wherever they're watching, not needing to actually socially interact. And then this bismuth acting as this sort of constant mediator that the screen becomes. So yeah, I guess that gives a bit of an introduction to the film. And I guess coming out from that, I had a bit of a question about whether you feel as though, you know, in this Stroke City, he intended that people learn the ability to give each other these positive strokes. And I was really interested in an article that I read of yours that was about sort of extrasensory perception in various ways, and whether you feel as though that is something that's really physiological, or whether there's a way in which we might all be able to learn to perceive in these specialist ways.
In terms of, so for example, could you learn to have synaesthesia, do you mean, or something like that?
Yeah, or ASMR, or super taste, or
yeah, so in terms of sensory differences, there's actually, very recently, there was a paper published training people to have synaesthesia, actually.
Okay,
so
okay.
There is some preliminary evidence, at least, that you can induce some of these types of experiences in people. You can induce synaesthesia as well through hypnosis. People also talk about relationships between hallucinogenic drugs, sometimes the synaesthesia. So in some ways, I guess it comes down to the extent to which some of these differences that you would see between, should we call them psychological quirks or perceptual quirks, it's the extent to which they are driven by a functional difference in someone's brain, which would imply we can all have these types of experiences. We just have to alter the way the brain's functioning in some way, and whether that's through some type of stimulation to the brain, or whether that's through some sort of training or learning mechanism. Or the other question is, well, maybe they're not a functional difference, maybe they're actually something that's hardwired and structurally different in someone's brain. In which case, if it's hardwired, that's much harder to induce. And I suppose, if we link it, going back to sort of mirror touch in a way, if one of the theories there is there's a threshold and people are going past this threshold and experiencing this state, then you would imagine anybody could experience that state if you get them past that threshold. And certainly there is some evidence using, it sounds kind of scary actually, it's used something called transcranial current stimulation. So this involves passing a very small amount of electric current into the brain. And it is a very small amount, it's enough to power a small flashlight. But what this does is it can boost the excitability of a brain region. And other groups have shown that if you increase the excitability of the somatosensory system when you view other people being touched, you can evoke mirror touch-like experiences in non-synesthetes, so people who don't have it. So there are ways in some respects. Now, whether the same would hold true with ASMR it's a very open question. The problem is because we don't know the mechanisms that drive ASMR, it's very hard to speculate. We don't know if it's because it's an overactive threshold in a certain system or not in many respects. So that's what makes it trickier to say in that context. But in relation to synesthesia, there is evidence that you can sort of induce some of these experiences. What I thought was quite interesting in the context of your last video as well, your last film, was in terms of how you came to the decisions of what would represent what aspect in terms of ASMR. I think that's an interesting question. So I wondered how you drew those comparisons yourselves.
Yeah, I guess I was keen to have, quite an abstracted sense of it, so that there wouldn't be any figuration in it, I guess, and, certainly in human terms.
Yeah.
But I guess, I wanted to have physically something that would be as comforting as I could imagine, you know, so sort of trying to represent it in those kind of maybe more conceptual terms rather than, something that was like an ASM artist, I guess, you know, and the same then for the prickly, the cold prickly and the spiny oyster, I guess, it's difficult, isn't it? Because trying to think through the motivation of the person viewing, that why would you choose to engage in your world in that way rather than engaging with the world around you, I guess, and whether that is sort of driving a need or whether it's actually, fulfilling a need. And it's quite, like that side of things is quite difficult to decide upon, really. Yeah. And I guess the bismuth for me was quite a cold, like so much of our touch experiences, I guess, in an urban environment are becoming narrowed down, and so that they're smooth, flat surfaces predominantly. Sure. And I guess there's something about our screen lives that is so poor in terms of actual tactile experience, that it's always flat and smooth, whereas I think we have a desire for it to be much more varied and expansive than that. And
adding texture to it.
And so I wonder whether, that lack is part of the drive for having so much material out there that is so visually tactile, as it were, like the ASMR stuff. I don't know. I mean, how do you feel as though our sensory perception is adapting to our screen lives?
It's an interesting question, actually. There's not any real clear work as such to really say, is it adapting or how is it adapting, I suppose. I mean, there's a lot of interest in how social interactions of things are influencing as they become more and more, should we say, less real, more online, how that can influence it. But I don't know of any real direct work in terms of sensory work, so that's a hard one to answer.
I know, but I guess maybe just from your personal point of view rather than from a professional point of view.
Yeah, I mean, I think your point there is quite interesting in terms of, which isn't something I really thought about at length before, about that idea about things being sort of flat and smooth quite commonly, and maybe that desire. So I do think that's definitely an interesting take on it.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that's, there's a total proliferation, isn't there, of like food-related programs on TV, say sort of Master Chef and Bake Off and all of that stuff, and you don't get to taste or smell any of it, but it's kind of really prominent, isn't it?
Trying to kind of evoke that kind of associated imagery with it.
Yeah.
Should we open up to questions from the audience? We do have a microphone, so does anybody have any questions or comments? Thoughts? Strange sensations? I had a question.
Yeah.
Or more just a curiosity about the when you were talking a little bit about testing for different responses and whether you use a live person demonstrating on a live person, or this idea of a presented dummy or a screen. And what's quite interesting about the ASMR thing is that in my mind it all exists online, and that how people receive that tingling response is it's all mediated, and I wonder how it works in real life. I know that some people talk about if they're watching somebody concentrating. That's another thing that's quite interesting, the idea of concentration and attention. If they're just watching somebody doing a task that requires a lot of concentration, they can find something very soothing about that as well. But again, that could be watching a video of it. Whereas if you're watching it in real life, or if somebody's whispering in your ear in real life, and what the difference is between it existing purely in a digital form or in real. I don't know, it's an interesting sort of...
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think it's interesting to think about how just general contextual kind of cues will influence the types of experiences that you're having, and the idea that obviously when it's online, you also just the environment you experience is much more passive. It's in your own home. You haven't necessarily got that kind of disturbed real life environment, and how that can feed in, and how that might influence just how automatic the experience is as well. I don't know of anybody who's reported the differences between real life and watching it on film and what they're
I guess the few people that I know who experience it did definitely reference this scenario about watching somebody doing something really concentrated. So one friend talked about when he was a child watching his brother or sister playing with Lego was really stimulating for him. And then more recently watching his daughter threading beads onto a sort of shoelace type, so that thing about really concentrated things. And I think one of the things that really predominates within it is you need to feel relaxed and not threatened in any way in order for it to be able to happen. So, another friend who has experiences it found that the Keep Delete film, that she would have tingles in response to some of the physical things she was watching, but she found the really involved narration pulled her back out again. So there was something about, having to concentrate on the argument that's effectively happening through the narration was sort of effectively pulling her back out of that experience. So.
It's more like an anti-stimulation or whatever the
Yeah,
de-stimulation
yeah.
is, that thing of switching off so that something happens rather than being stimulated to activate your brain in some sort of strange way.
Yeah, no, and it comes back. I mean, it also comes back to that idea about. I mean, people are talking about this in the concept of being automatic and automatic experience, but with situations like that where you've got kind of dual attention, the fact that that potentially could modulate the experience or suppress the experience almost speaks against, in some respects, it being necessarily automatic, as it were, because it can be modulated in that way. So I think those kind of examples are really informative. I mean, again, it needs systematically to be studied, but I think as a first cue, it's really interesting in that regard. Yeah.
There's a question here.
Hi guys, first of all thank you very much for this evening, been really fascinating. Wanted to talk about, as an artist, how you choose the senses to combine when you're making the videos. I think I'm completely new to the whole topic myself, and it's only when I saw the talk did I start looking, like yourself Emma, on Wiki and YouTube. And for me nothing has quite grabbed me as much as having the video upstairs shows quite well. It's having sound coming out and the lip movement being completely wrong. For me, growing up with hearing difficulties, I relied on sight to confirm what it was I was hearing. So having that challenged and having that torn apart almost kind of makes them heightens those senses. So how do you consciously choose a few senses to put onto film, or is it more of a natural, organic thing?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I have been conscious in this last body of work to bring touch and vision together. And for me, yeah, those are the two that are most primary in my own sort of sensibility. But of course, audio is very much part of film too. And so I feel like that aspect of my practice is relatively new, and I'm just beginning to develop, and there's so much potential in that. And I really enjoyed actually in this film doing some Foley, I guess, for some of the films, in particular the Spiny Oyster as it was opening. I was snapping spaghetti and doing various things in order to make that sound and trying to match that to the action of the stop frame animation that I'd done. Was really interesting. But it's definitely not primary for me. I feel as though perhaps in my own mind the relationship between touch and vision is more blurred for me than it is between the other senses that I have. Because I have a feeling that there isn't sort of synaesthetes or not, or there isn't ASMR experiences or not, but that there's much more of a kind of spectrum of experience, and that we all, in our own ways, have idiosyncrasies in response to the way in which we perceive the world. And I think for me personally that touch and vision are particularly closely related. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does
Okay.
actually. It's just interesting to see where the start point is.
Yeah.
So what it is that first goes through your mind when you first think of the next video.
Yeah. Good.
Any other questions or thoughts? One of the things that you mentioned earlier, actually, about the senses being sort of linked to what you'd mentioned as well, is the identifying the senses with synaesthesia, and that being easily identifiable, rather than this, what is just referred to as a tingling sensation. Whereas if it's taste or touch that's being switched, or you can very definitely feel something, if they feel something on their face, it's all a bit more solidly identifiable, I suppose, rather than a more abstract, internal, it's only you that can sort of try and articulate what it is, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an interesting thing, because that's one way in which, one thing that people have said is with mirror touch, synaesthesia, where people feel touch when they see touch to others. One question is, if you say that's a type of synaesthesia, does that open up to all sorts of mirrored experiences? So when we see somebody itching, quite often it can make us feel itchy, but is that a type of synaesthesia as well, you could ask? And I suppose one thing that tends to distinguish these experiences is that with mirror touch it's much more specific and mapped in a one-to-one way, face to face, hand to hand, and so on and so forth. Whereas with something like itchiness, as it were, or ASMR tingling, quite often wherever they see, if you see someone itching, let's say itching their arm even, quite often people itch their head or something like that. It's just, that's the kind of mappings that you see. It's not always one-to-one. And I suppose another interesting thing as well, in relation to things like vision to touch and synaesthesia versus the tactile experiences in ASMR as well, is also thinking about, there's a very clear sensory aspect in synaesthesia in terms of the inducer. So you're seeing somebody being touched. That's kind of, you're trying to almost map the sensory consequence. But quite often with something like itch as well, if you show somebody images of bugs, that's more likely to evoke a sensation than actually showing them somebody itching, which is suggesting more of an affective component, which might be more prominently in play in something like ASMR. So there's a few different levels to that, I suppose. But yeah, you do find in synaesthesia it's much more kind of specific. And it is very specific and consistent over time. So with the guy who experiences tastes from words, for example, a gentleman we've worked with, we've tested him over decades and his experiences haven't changed for the same words. There's the name Gordon still tastes the same 10 years on. So there's things like this where synesthetic experiences are very consistent and very specific. Very mapped in a kind of somatotopic, or in a spatial way actually, across different types of synesthesia.
And I think that does sort of lead to ASMR being quite a difficult thing to categorise, to pin down, to define, in order to then begin to approach it. And have you got to the stage yet where you're thinking about how you might, narrow it down? And
ASMR is. That's part of the problem is it is very broad and there's so many layers to it. And from a scientific perspective, if we want to study something, what we need to do is take a really consistent experiment that we can bring into the lab and focus on one attribute. And so at the moment, what we're really trying to look at is what types of things can induce experiences, and can we strip those experiences away in some way? So if you're playing a video where you've got vision and sound to it, what happens if you take the auditory stimulus away? Do you still get those types of experiences reported? What happens if you play the stimuli backwards? What happens if you flip them upside down? All sorts of things that might maintain the same visual quality, but change the sort of the input that could evoke it. And then once we can distinguish stimuli that do and don't experience, then we can try to get into, okay, now can we contrast what happens when someone has an experience as to when they don't have an experience. And it's something, as I said, we've been doing a lot of screening work to try to get to that point. We're now trying to take that forward to now see, okay, well, if we can separate people between, we call them responders and non-responders, or stimuli that do and don't, and then bring them in and test them more thoroughly with more kind of lab-based tests with neuroimaging and so on and so forth, to try to sort of tap into their self-reports a bit more. But there is so many. The real thing with ASMR, as you see with your films, are that there's so many different types of inducers and so much variability for different people, that it becomes very hard to say. A one-size-fits-all isn't really the way to go. But the commonality can be induce versus non-induce in terms of what we can use in research. So that's kind of where we're at with it.
Yeah. Okay.
Oh, hello.
So it's been fascinating, thank you. I just wondered what the prevalence for synaesthesia is. You've had some years of studying it. Can you give some kind of data on that?
Yeah, sure. So the minimum prevalence rate, people, at least what people currently accept, is 4% of all types of synaesthesia, that is. Now that goes back to a study that was run in 2006 by Julia Simner, who's based at University of Sussex, and that involved screening a number of people at the Science Museum and also at various universities, and then objectively testing them to verify their synesthetic experiences. And that came to, as I say, about 4%. Now, for all types, they found that one of the most common types was days to colour, days of the week to colour. So, for example, Monday being red, Thursday being blue. And also something like grapheme colour synesthesia had a prevalence of about 1.4%. So that's where digits evoke colours. Now, since that time, people have reported other types of synesthesia. So there was no mirror touch, for example, wasn't included in the 4% estimate. Another type of synesthesia where vision evokes sound has been reported. So I don't know if people remember the old Windows screensaver flying through space, but basically for some people this can evoke kind of auditory beeps with the movement of it, and so that type of synesthesia isn't included in that 4%. So it would potentially suggest it's a bit higher than 4%, but that's for all types, as I say. That's the minimum prevalence estimate at the moment.
Thank you. And is there any are there plans to kind of do that prevalence testing again?
Yeah, I mean, it will go on. I mean, that probably will be redone over time. I mean, we've tested the prevalence of mirror touch on its own, and we have a prevalence rate of 1.6% for that, but we didn't look for other types of synesthesia at the time. So it is ongoing. People are also looking at the prevalence of synesthesia in children, because weirdly, although it's considered a developmental experience or developmental condition, as it were, there's actually only a handful of studies on synesthesia in children. So most of the work's been done in adults, and we're testing in adults once the associations are really fixed. We don't really know how these links develop throughout life. We don't know if it's as common in children, or maybe it's more common and people lose it. We really don't necessarily have all that data. I mean, there is one study on that also done by Jules Simler that suggests it is kind of as common in children, but what happens is over time the mappings start to get stronger. So to begin with, people are less consistent in their mappings, so it's not always, let's say that, I don't know, Gordon tasted bacon, but over time, as that mapping gets stronger, then it will always be Gordon tasted bacon, even decades later. So there's some work ongoing with that. But yeah, so there will be more work in that front. A lot of the work now is actually trying to look at the genetic mechanisms that might contribute to synesthesia, and the neural mechanisms that contribute to how maybe sort of genetic shifts might change how someone's brain develops, and how that might contribute to how someone has or doesn't have synesthesia. And the other question is, what type of synesthesia will someone develop? Because it's really common. Synesthesia runs in families. And it's very common. You might have two people in the same family, brother and sister, but they'll have different types of synesthesia. So one may have days of the week and colours, the other may have music and colours, or words and tastes. And so the question is, potentially it's the same genetic mechanism, but why are they being expressed in different ways is an open question as well.
Thank you.
No worries.
I just wanted to kind of, as another form of perceptual abnormality, kind of refer to phantom limbs, for instance, and some of the research that's been done in kind of, I know the clinician Ramachandran, who's written some best-selling books related to his work with regards to tricking people who have phantom limbs with neuropathic pain, trying to trick that neuropathic pain out of them by creating kind of like an illusion of where they're seeing what they think is their phantom limb in an intact position, or performing certain tasks. And just to bring that perhaps back to, these abnormal perceptual things, how maybe they can be useful if we take advantage of them.
Absolutely. So, in the case of phantom limbs, just in case anyone's not familiar, this can be following amputation. Sometimes people can still feel their limb is there, even though it might not be there. And some people can get pain from this because it could be in the wrong angle and so on and so forth. And what's been done is people have used mirrors to try to trick the system. So you can show somebody the mirrored perspective of a limb that's in the right place, but it would be where the phantom would be, and it then looks like the phantom limb's shifted. And this actually can reduce the sort of problems that people experience from the phantom limbs. And this is because vision, as a general sense, dominates over touch. And so this is one way, and this is true, there's a kind of strong body of evidence in this for all of us that vision is very dominant over our senses. We have a huge representation of it in terms of neurally in our brains. So as a consequence, because of this, you can try and use these types of mechanisms, these relations between the senses to aid. So absolutely, that's a really good example of how you can use cross-sensory interactions to help. And phantom limbs is a really good one.
I think if there's no further questions, probably a good time to wrap up and just say thank you very much to our two speakers for a really fascinating discussion. And the installation, for those of you who haven't seen it or would like to see it again, will be open all day tomorrow and Thursday, so please do come back and spend some time with the works. And yes, thank you all for coming.
Thanks.
Thank you.